Picture this.
You're a history teacher, and a student asks you a simple question. Did gay people exist before the 1900s? Your textbook gives you exactly two options. Either pretend ancient people were just like us, but more repressed, or treat every same-sex relationship as some weird footnote nobody really practiced. Neither one is true. And the real answer is a myth so thoroughly debunked that most historians stopped arguing about it decades ago, even though nobody told the rest of us. Women have loved women since there have been women. Men have loved men since there have been men. Societies have recognized genders beyond male and female since the first religions were written down. The difference between then and now isn't whether it existed. It's who was allowed to write it down and who later burned the pages. Today, while covering the actual record, Greece, Rome, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the pre-colonial Americas, Mughal India, Japan, and Polynesia. And we're covering the second half of the story too, the part usually left out, the deliberate, coordinated, centuries-long effort to erase all of it. Because understanding the erasure matters just as much as understanding what was erased. Let's get into it.
Greece, where everyone was some kind of gay. Start with the one everybody already half knows. In classical Athens, the most documented relationships were between grown men and adolescent boys, a structure called pederasty. And it wasn't hidden. It was philosophy. Socrates argued this bond was nobler than heterosexual love because it was driven by the soul instead of the body. The Spartans took it further and built it into military doctrine. Soldiers fought beside the men they loved on the theory that shame in front of a lover was scarier than death. The sacred band of Thebes, an elite unit made entirely of paired male lovers, was legendary until it was wiped out at Chaeronea in 338 BCE. But here's the part your textbook skips. This wasn't about gender. It was about status. The older partner lost nothing by being with a man. The younger, receiving partner was the one who risked being seen as lesser. Because in the Greek mind, what mattered wasn't who you loved, it was whether you were the one in control. That's a completely different logic than ours, and historians still argue about whether it's fair to even call these men gay.
And women weren't absent from this, they were just recorded differently. Sappho of Lesbos, the origin of the word lesbian itself, wrote poetry so explicit about desire for other women that Plato called her the 10th muse. Of her 9 original books, we have 1 complete poem and scraps of the rest, because the rest was lost, and scholars still debate whether lost means burned. What survives describes watching a woman across a room and cataloging her own body's collapse in response. Her heart pounding, her tongue failing, her skin on fire. That is not metaphor. That's a woman documenting being undone by desire for another woman. And it was good enough that people kept hand copying it for 1,000 years. Why does Sappho get remembered when so many women don't? Because women in Athens were kept out of public life entirely. Married young, confined to the house, their inner lives considered irrelevant to the historical record. Sparta was the exception. Spartan women trained athletically, owned property, and had far more freedom. And it's exactly there that we find Plutarch describing older women mentoring younger ones in bonds he compares directly to male pederasty. Wherever women got more freedom, the evidence gets very slightly less silent. That's not a coincidence. That's the pattern for the rest of this video.
Rome, the empire that couldn't keep it in its toga. Rome didn't care about the gender of your partner. It cared about one thing. Were you the one penetrating or the one being penetrated? A free citizen could sleep with anyone lower in status, women, slaves, boys from poor families, and lose nothing. What was humiliating was being on the receiving end if you were a citizen, because that role was reserved for people beneath you.
Emperor Hadrian's relationship with the young Antinous was one of the most publicly celebrated relationships in antiquity. When Antinous died, Hadrian deified him, minted his face onto coins, and built temples across the empire. Nobody hid this. But when Nero married a male slave and took the receiving role himself, Roman writers treated it as proof of his decadence, not because he loved a man, but because he'd made himself the lesser partner. Women appear here too, mostly through hostility. Roman medical writers described women who desired women as suffering a disease of excess heat in need of a cure. That sounds damning until you read it correctly. You don't write a medical chapter about something that doesn't exist. The poet Martial mocked a woman named Bassa for loving only women. His disgust is ironically one of our best pieces of evidence that she was real. Rome's silence on female relationship.
Egypt and Mesopotamia? Older than you think. Around 2400 BCE, two men named Khnum-hotep and Niankhnum were buried together in ancient Egypt, depicted nose to nose in the Egyptian gesture of intimacy, labeled in their own tomb as beloved of the king. That's not a modern reading forced onto old evidence. That's exactly how they described themselves, in the most permanent medium their civilization had. Mesopotamia goes even further. Temples of the goddess Inanna employed the Gala priests, people who lived outside the male-female binary entirely, and were considered not degraded but holy, believed to hold spiritual power precisely because they crossed the line the rest of society lived inside. One of them, Ur-Nammu, went on to become king. A gender non-conforming priest becoming head of state wasn't a scandal. It was Tuesday. The Americas and the war on two-spirit identity. Across pre-colonial North America, tribes recognized genders beyond male and female as sacred, not tolerated, sacred. The Navajo Nadlahi combined male and female spiritual roles. The Lakota Winte and the Zuni Lamana held ceremonial, artistic, and healing positions at the center of their communities, not the margins. In 1886, a Zuni Lamana named Wewa met President Grover Cleveland as an official tribal representative. And Cleveland had no idea he'd just shaken hands with someone his own culture would have called a different gender entirely.
Then, Christian missionaries and government boarding schools arrived with one explicit goal: erase this. Children were taken from their families and punished for any sign of gender nonconformity. That trauma didn't end when the schools closed. It's still being repaired today, which is exactly why the modern two-spirit movement isn't just about reclaiming history. It's about healing a wound that colonization made on purpose. Mughal India and the empire that wrote love poems to men. Here's the uncomfortable one. The Mughal Empire, an Islamic empire, produced some of history's most explicit celebrations of male same-sex love, in poetry performed at court, not hidden in the margins. Emperor Jahangir wrote about his own attraction to men in his own autobiography. Shah Jahan, the man who built the Taj Mahal for a woman, also had documented male lovers, and his court poets treated that love as equal in dignity to any heterosexual romance. History doesn't resolve into a clean story where one religion or empire is simply the good guys. It's messier than that, always. Japan and Polynesia? Different logic entirely. Japan built an entire aesthetic and social category, the wakashu, for young men who were the accepted objects of male desire for centuries. This wasn't underground. It was the dominant form of male romantic love in Japanese society, with its own literature and etiquette. Neither Buddhism nor Shinto treated it as sin. That only changed in 1872, when the Meiji government criminalized it, not out of ancient tradition, but specifically to look civilized to Western colonial powers watching them. Across the Pacific, Hawaiian mahu, Samoan fa'afafine, and Tongan whakaliti all held recognized third-gender roles central to healing, ceremony, and craft. Captain Cook documented mahu in Tahiti in the 1700s.
Then Christian missionaries arrived, and the word Mahu itself was turned into a slur within a generation. The erasure, and why it's the real story. Notice the pattern repeating across every single culture we just covered. Missionaries arrive. Local tradition gets declared sinful. Colonial law gets used to enforce that declaration. In India, the British wrote laws against carnal intercourse against the order of nature that stayed on the books until 2018. In Japan, it was the Meiji criminalization. In the Americas and the Pacific, it was boarding schools and slurs.
This wasn't the restoration of some natural ancient order. It was the imposition of a brand new one. And it worked so well that when we bring any of this up today, it sounds radical, like we're making it up. We're not. We're reading the exact same sources that were sitting in libraries the whole time. The people who wrote our textbooks just chose not to mention them. And here's the last thing worth sitting with. The gaps in the record aren't proof that these people didn't exist. Most of the evidence we have for women who loved women survives because someone hostile wrote it down to condemn it. A doctor pathologizing it, a satirist mocking it, a lawmaker trying to ban it. You don't write hundreds of years of laws and medical texts and jokes about something that isn't there. Silence in a historical record produced entirely by men, for men, isn't evidence of absence. It's evidence of what got left out on purpose. History was never as simple as anyone wanted it to be. It still isn't. And for a few thousand years, in Egypt and Mesopotamia and Sparta and Edo, Japan, and 100 island nations across the Pacific, humans built room for the full range of who we are. Right up until an empire decided that room needed to be taken away. It's still being taken back in courts and classrooms and conversations right now.